is red, then your mic is muted, just to save on the feedback on the recording. That would be grand, and there will be opportunity to hopefully ask a few questions of Iain at the end of the talk. So Dr. Iain Robertson joined the Centre for History in September 2015. I think that's right, Iain. And he has researched and published very extensively on social protest in the Highlands. And today we'll be talking about spaces of assertion, informal land occupations in the Scottish Highlands after 1914. Over to you, Iain.
Thank you very much, Alison, and thank you very much, everybody who has joined. It's very exciting to see so many people rolling in. So thank you very much. Without further ado, I'll get started. First of all, by sharing my screen, sharing my PowerPoint. So breathe in, Iain, and share. Oh, I think that has worked. If anybody can't see the PowerPoint, they could possibly send a wee message to Alison, or let me know, and we'll try and do something about it. But assuming we're good to go, I'll begin. So, on the 14th of June, 1920, a group of over 30 men, women and children. That's kind of weird. Sorry about this. My PowerPoint has stopped working, which is really annoying. Hang on a second. I shall see what's gone wrong here. Sorry about this. If I stop sharing for a moment and have another go, it's really weird. So bear with me. Right, sorry about this, folks. I'll have one last try to share my PowerPoint and try again. Okay, so that looks like it might be working. Alison, do you think it's working?
Yeah, I can see that, Iain. Yeah.
Okay, cool. And yeah, there we go. That's better. So, as I was saying, sorry about that slight technical hitch. As I was saying, on the 14th of June 1920, a group of over 30 men, women and children assembled in the town of Portskerra, located on the north coast of the county of Sutherland. From there, they marched in military fashion onto Kirkton Farm, just across the border in Caithness, and some 2 miles distant from Portskerra. You can see there how long the walk might have taken them. According to Google Maps, some 34 minutes. But on this walk, they were led by a piper. And this highly organised group of land raiders took sheep and cattle with them, driving these sheep and cattle onto the farm as formal and symbolic gestures of the occupation of land. Once that was achieved, driving the sheep and cattle onto the land, once that was achieved, the piper led them in a dance. The people, not the sheep and cattle, of course. The piper led them in a dance on the seized ground, with a second dance held that evening back in Portskerra. Now, the land invasion at Kirkton was just one, albeit a particularly visible one. Land invasion at Kirkton was just one manifestation of the most significant form of land protests that took place across the Highlands and Islands between the 1880s and the 1950s. And yes, I did say the 1950s. That's not a slip of the tongue. The last land raid was not that enacted by the 7 men of Knoydart in 1948. Now, land protests in the Highlands after 1880 have become known collectively as the Land Wars. This lengthy period of reassertion and reclamation amounting to one of the longest running protest movements ever seen in the UK. A protest movement, moreover, which resurfaced as the community land buyout movement less than 50 years after the last seizure had taken place. Now, there is much that could be said and still needs to be said about land raiding, but I'm not here today to do that. Instead, but also, my particular interest lies in the period after the end of World War I, the later Highland Land Wars as we should know it. And in this period, that of Highland protests after November 1918, in this period, we can be absolutely certain that the land raid was but one form, albeit the most impactful form. Land raiding was but one form of protest turned to by crofters and cotters. There were, in short, several other important tools in the protesters' toolbox, each of which I would suggest has its own distinct geography and chronology. My focus today is on that top line, what I have called the informal occupation of land. My purpose is to alert you to the existence of this particular form of protest, to consider something of its characteristics, to explore a little of its chronology and geography. But above all, I aim to illustrate the shape, course, and impact of one informal land occupation as case study. That case study being the informal occupation of parts of Glencanisp deer forest in Assynt in the far northwest of the region. And on that map on the right of your screen there, please ignore the arrow to Torridon. This was the only map I could find that actually kind of identified where Assynt might be, and I got a bonus of Torridon thrown in there as well. Now, this informal occupation at Glencanisp was undertaken primarily by crofters, sheep and cattle. It began, we're not certain, but in all likelihood it began in the early years of the 20th century and lasted until at least 1938 and probably later. It is difficult, if not impossible, to be any more certain than that. And these are archivally elusive acts. Informal occupation of land appears in the record only infrequently and inconsistently, and often only when key characteristics of the form cease to apply. And this is very much the case for Glencanisp. Alongside sketching in the outline of the form informal occupation took, I want also to explore a little of the suggestion that what informal land occupations manifest are what I would call spaces of assertion. Spaces of assertion. Highland deer forest was and is one of the most privatised and securitized rural spaces. Organised almost entirely for sport, keepers, gillies and watchers combined to exclude those who did not belong, both human and non-human. But exclusion often proved impossible. In their trespass, in their resistance, in their transgressions, the human and non-human dug, grazed, walked over and crapped on this sacred ground. In so doing, these very fleshy interventions reworked these supposedly exclusionary spaces into something else, into an assertion of an other sense of the appropriate nature of the use of that space, of the appropriate assemblage of fauna and fauna gathered therein. In short, informal land occupations were, as much as the more visible and more celebrated land raid, informal land occupations were spaces of the assertion of counter-hegemonic values. The key figure in land invasion historiography is Eric Hobsbawm. Hobsbawm both set the framework for the study of land occupations and the form these have been understood to have taken. Hobsbawm was also keen to assign and identify class roles and class positions within these conflicts, but also to categorise according to type, to categorise protest according to type. As part of this categorisation, Hobsbawm also identified strong standardised form to the invasion wherever it was found, and he found it in Peru, in Italy and in Ireland. The informal occupation of land, I would argue, stands in direct challenge to much of this. And so, in order to understand what we see when we see the informal occupation, we must turn to the more recent or to the most recent thinking in protest studies. Now, I have neither the time nor inclination to stray too far into what is becoming a vast literature here, as I'm actually really keen to explore the informal occupation through my case study. And so I'll just note the bare bones of my influences. Taking inspiration from Katrina Navakas's work on the microspaces comprising the moors and fields used for 19th century radical political meetings, I pay close attention to the sensitivities of the local and the particular, to an engagement, we might say, with the micropolitics of space. The importance of Katrina's and indeed other recent protest historiography is that it points to the shaping role of the dynamics of local topographies in protest performances. As they move through and encounter their everyday world, people engage with and are engaged by landscape, engaged with and engaged by landscape on an emotional and bodily level. Denial of that movement, denial of that engagement, while that can provoke resistance, it can provoke reassertion. Most significant for an understanding of the informal occupation of land, I would suggest, however, is Nigel Thrift's assertion that places are constituted by, and here I'm quoting, a spatial dance between human and non-human actants. In following this path, in placing some emphasis on the non-human, in following this path, then I've been inspired by the work of the Centre for History's own Elizabeth Ritchie, who has revealed the fundamental importance of cattle and sheep to crofter identity and crofter and cotter placemaking. Whilst Carl Griffin has demonstrated importantly demonstrated the importance of non-human actants in resistance to new plantations in the 18th and 19th century New Forest in southern England. These then are my influences. Let's now sketch a little bit about the informal occupation of land as I see it. At its base, we can understand informality as the utilisation of areas of land by crofters or cotters for which they paid no rent and to which they had no legal entitlement. A second major characteristic would be longevity. As I've already hinted, informal occupation could endure for many years. And it could endure for many years because landowners could not or would not take steps to end the occupation. Indeed, such is the fluidity of the resultant situation produced by the ambivalent attitudes of these landowners to the responsibilities of property. Such is the fluidity of the situation then that results. It can actually be very difficult to ascertain when occupation ceased, or even if it ever did cease. Whilst small in number, informal land occupation was most often evident on the Scottish mainland, the area where land seizure occurred the least. Perhaps a function of the amount of land encompassed by mainland estates. Land protests in this area were more easily and more often embraced informality. The commitment to resist and transgress private property rights were clearly there. It simply took the most contextually appropriate form. Take for a moment the example of Borve deer forest on the island of Harris. The instance of informal occupation here evidences both the enduring nature of these events and the breadth of performances encapsulated therein. Informality at Borve begins in formal land raiding. By 1926, however, the Department of Agriculture was able to report that the sporadic raiding of the forest, Borve deer forest, has not reoccurred in recent years, I quote. This was not because the desire for land had gone away. Instead, as the owner was only interested in sport, he had ignored the trespass of stock, mainly sheep. He ignored the trespass of stock belonging to crofters and cotters from the bays of Harris over on effectively the other side of the island. This was not because the desire for land had gone away. Far from it. It is simply that formal raiding had been replaced by informal occupation. Informal occupation facilitated by the fact that the boundary fence between Borve and the bay's common grazings frequently broken. Now, it is impossible to say when this fence breaking first began, but the difficulty the department had in getting the fence mended once it had been broken and once they had purchased the estate suggests that fence breaking at Borve may have been a very long-standing situation. Now, the Board of Agriculture was established under the 1911 Small Landholders Act, and one of its main objectives was to address Highland land issues. The board, later the department, the board had the power to formulate land settlement schemes. Land settlement in the form either of new holdings or enlargements to existing holdings. As with most other informal occupations, Borve only gained the Board of Agriculture's full attention when Borve estate was sold. This made them, the Board of Agriculture, this made them fearful that any new owner would be intolerant of informality, thereby creating the potential for a renewal of disorder. Thus, the informal occupation may well best emerged into plain archival sight when it was no longer acceptable to those in legal possession of the land. At that point, when it actually emerges into archival plain sight, at that point, informality is often moving into a more formal act of protest. This view of the informal occupation of land as a distinct expression of protest is given greater weight by the fact that landowners, their representatives and government officials all believed that this is exactly what it was. An example of this comes from Barvas on the island of Lewis. In the early 1920s, the township lands remained unfenced, with custom and local memory preserving the Glebe and township land boundaries. But in 1921, the Board of Agriculture's local officer reported, and here I'm quoting, all the lands raided, even though there had been no declaration of a raid taking place, even though those whose stock were on the ground denied that they were raiders. This made little difference. Stock being grazed on the ground in defiance of custom and private property. Stock being grazed on the ground without people. Stock being grazed on the ground was, the sub-commissioner believed, was a land invasion. It was a non-human land invasion. It was an act of protest. This recognition of raiding via informality strongly suggests that protest in the Highlands and Islands after 1918, at the very least, strongly suggests that protest was both mutable and shaped by local contexts. An intransigent landlord. I suspect a fair few of you listening in on this today would recognise intransigent landlords. An intransigent landlord was undoubtedly one such local context. Faced with intransigence, the tenantry could often react by using the weaponry of the relatively powerless. Using the weaponry of the relatively powerless, in which, as at Barvas, the non-human could be mobilised as agents of assertion. Everyday, quotidian and incremental conflict often centred around sheep. Tenants on Egg, for instance, were prevented from keeping sheep were prevented from keeping sheep by the island's owner. They were prevented from keeping sheep because the owner believed that the sheep would introduce disease into his supposedly superior stock. Now, this ban on sheep did not last beyond the creation of a croft enlargement scheme for some of the island townships. But the ban did turn sheep into a weapon of protest and created at the same time an informal occupation. Before boundary fences for the new enlargements had been erected, the landlord agreed that crofters' sheep could graze the new enlargements. They could graze the new enlargements, but only, here I'm quoting, if they kept a boy on watch so that the animals might be confined to the proposed enlargements. This provision, this agreement, was observed more in the breach, however, and it was not long before these supposed inferior ruminants had crossed the invisible boundary and were grazing where they shouldn't. These then are the outline characteristics of this distinct protest form. I'd now like to turn to the working out of the informal occupation in Glencanisp deer forest as means to illustrate some finer points. And at this point, I'd also like to thank Malcolm Banger-Jones for his help in identifying the boundaries as they stood in the 1930s of Glencanisp forest and Crofters Common grazings. Thank you, Malcolm. Now, much of what follows when we explore informality in Glencanisp, much of what follows is based on a set of extensive reports compiled between 1936 and 1938 by Department of Agriculture Scotland officials. I also draw on senior officials' responses to these reports, which were not, of course, made public. So let's get going. Glencanisp deer forest comprised approximately 34,000 acres in the 1930s. Being a comparatively recent creation, there was an accompanying near constant agitation for land from local crofters and cotters, from townships such as Clashmore, Inverkirkade, Strathan and Benadryl. Beginning in resistance to clearance, by the 1930s, this campaign had endured for over a century and in the forest had evolved into an informal occupation of land of some long standing. The written campaign for enlargements in the deer forest met constant rejection, however, constant rejection by successive government agencies. And it was rejected on the grounds of the high compensation that would be awarded for damage to the sporting interests. Now, this was always the case when deer forests were considered for land settlement. And it is perhaps no coincidence that many of the informal occupations I have identified took place in such forests. Glencanisp, however, had experienced a significant fall in the value of the sporting rights, from £850 per annum in 1899 to £240 in 1936. In today's values, that is a drop of approximately from £110,000 to £17,000. Now, there are, of course, multiple reasons for this, but the sub-commissioner reporting on the situation felt that one strong reason for the consequence of this fall was the fact that crofters, sheep and cattle had been present in the forest for many years. The sporting space was no longer sacrosanct. Far too many S's in that sentence. Highland land disturbances were about the reassertion of appropriate forms of human, non-human assemblages, encouraging and facilitating stock to trespass is one such reassertion, and a prime characteristic of the informal land occupation. Key too is the fact that the archive is mainly silent on precise dates for the length of time any informal occupation endured. Thus, at Glencanisp, when sheep and cattle incursions began, well, that was disputed, but it certainly dates from the first decade of the 20th century. Intriguingly, and possibly not coincidentally, local crofters suggested 1886 as the starting point, the year of the Crofters Act. What we can be certain about, however, that in 1921 there were approximately 1,000 illicit sheep and 15 similarly transgressive cattle in the forest, with numbers increasing. Glencanisp confirms another key characteristic of this protest form. In 1913, the estate was purchased by Major General Stewart. Stewart was sympathetic to the crofters' needs. This led to a rough and ready reciprocal practice in which the crofters, and again I'm quoting, would make no fuss about the deer which strolled onto their holdings in the winter, and the proprietor made no fuss about sheep which strayed onto his forests. In short, informal occupations were made and maintained as much as by estate owners and officers, as much as they were made by crofters and cotters. But not all smooth sailing at Glencanisp. At least twice before 1936, Major Stewart attempted to regularise the situation, to raise some rent, in other words. But this was doomed to failure. Doomed because informality and irregularity suited the crofters, suited their purpose, which was, of course, unfettered access. So informality continued until 1936, when the estate was sold once again, this time to the Vesti family. Now, with this purchase, we are moving on to the next stage of the informal occupation and its emergence into the light of historical scrutiny. This emergence required the Department of Agriculture to take a more consistent interest in the case, and a new proprietor to take an oppositional stance to the occupation. Indeed, the former, greater interest from the department, usually required the presence of the latter, opposition to occupation from the new landlord. This was exactly the situation at Glencanisp. In 1936, in confirmation that trouble was brewing, came from the estate solicitors. They wrote to the department arguing for the total removal of the crofters' stock, as trespass was, and I'm quoting, endemic and habitual. Conflict was now assured. Thus, in 1936, we reached the next step in the stately gavotte that is the informal occupation of land. The Vestes attempt to return to the normal social relations, the normal nature-cultural interactions of an exclusionary space, and that attempt provokes a forceful reaction from the crofters. The department consequently felt obligated to energise one of its primary purposes, the creation of new holdings, with the local sub-commissioner for Assynt taking the view that there was no alternative but to consider a compulsory scheme. Now, the power of compulsory purchase was used only rarely, but contemplated often, especially when faced with an intransigent landlord such as William Vesti. As our sympathetic sub-commissioner went on to say, that these crofters should be deprived of grazing. Oh, I've got ahead of myself. Sorry about that. That these crofters should be deprived of grazing for these sheep in order that a millionaire may have a monopoly over 30 to 40,000 acres for the sport of deer stalking is not a position which can be easily justified. You can say that one again. Here too, we should perhaps remind ourselves of the power of the local agent. In the post-war world, local Board of Agriculture sub-commissioners were powerful actors set alongside and often set in opposition to the estate factor. Moreover, the attitude of both factor and sub-commissioner to the informal occupation clearly shaped its performance. Thus, in 1936, notwithstanding the supposed hardline attitude of the Sutherland estate, local memory in 1936 had it that their factor, the Sutherland factor, ignored sheep and cow incursions onto the estate. By contrast, the more benevolent attitude of General Stuart was not shared by his factor, who would have cleared the forest of crofters' stock. This factor was retained under the new Vestey regime, and his views therefore accorded much more closely to those of his owner. He, however, lasted only a year, and his successor was again, and here I'm quoting, very anxious to have a quiet and satisfactory settlement. It would also seem that in 1936-37, the proprietor had realised the limits of his local control. By 1937, he was in negotiations with senior department figures in Edinburgh over the terms for a private enlargement scheme. This was not a scheme under either the 1911 or 1919 Acts, however, and it was on this the rocks of this refusal to formulate a scheme under the Act, it was on the rocks of this refusal that this initiative broke. Over the winter of 37, the crofters considered the merits of this proposed private scheme, but they ultimately rejected it as the terms were unacceptable. Department officers were unsurprised, with internal senior opinion of the scheme and its owner stark. And here I'm quoting again, and it was the one I put up to go. Throughout the document, there is a tyrannical touch in the phraseology that is reminiscent of the pre-1886 years, which is, and you can almost hear this little cough, ill-advised. That mood was swiftly revealed in a series of events that very firmly delineate the informal occupation of land as an act of protest.
To have temporarily lost Iain. Hopefully he makes his way back in a minute or two.
And resistance. At Glencanisp, then, there was never any attempt to declare a formal land raid. Looks like my sharing has stopped for some reason. I will attempt to resume. I hope I'm sharing still. There was never any attempt to declare a formal land raid. The land was already held by sheep, cattle, and people. Indeed, local people used the front drive of the Vestey's house with impunity and without paying for the privilege. They roamed, and here I'm quoting, over the whole of the forest, even during the stalking season. Only appropriate assemblages of the human and the non-human were treated with respect. Everything else was up for challenge. Indeed, across the winter of 36 and into 37, as events became ever more conflictual, that challenge took on an ever darkening hue. What emerged for a short period, admittedly, what emerged was something akin to guerrilla warfare. On two separate occasions, the fence between the crofters' common grazings and the deer forest was broken down. In July, almost 4 miles of fence was destroyed, with department officials stating that the damage was so extensive that it, and again I'm quoting, that it could not be done except by a large party acting in concert. Crofters went on to claim that traps had been set both in the forest, which was killing their lambs, and in our own land, which had killed, again I'm quoting, nearly every cat we had about our houses. There is no indication that this was direct retaliation by the crofters, no indication. But at the same time, it was reported that 6 dogs belonging to the estate watchers were found dead of unknown causes. Finally, on the 18th of July, 1938, the estate solicitors reported that at least 12 different fires had been set in Glencanisp 3 days previously. This produced the following sarky comment from a department official: "Thunderstorms and dry weather, lightning struck, the elements work against Mr. Vesty." For his part, Mr. Vesty let it be known that he would curtail his activities in Assynt unless this kind of trouble ceases. Fences are invariably multifunctional, aiming to control and condition space, aiming to control and condition human and non-humans at one and at the same time. To break fences is a deeply transgressive act. All the more so in the Highlands, where they often represented and materialised profound divisions between the crofting and sporting life worlds. At Balmacan Deer Forest, for example, another informal occupation went sour, and in 1923 the estate factor reported the removal of or damage to gate padlocks. Heather had been burnt inappropriately. Fences were broken, and about 200 fence posts burnt or damaged, along with, I quote, a large extent of ground.
So then, can you give Poppy a breakfast?
Alongside this proactivity, Highland fences were often absent or suffered from benign neglect in the challenging physical environment. These absences suggest a situation where the division of land use, may well have been stronger on paper than in reality. The creation of deer forest is a form of mental and material enclosure. And as Blomley has suggested, the idea of enclosure was to physically perform exclusion. Some things were placed outside, other things were placed supposedly out of harm inside the enclosure. Indeed, as Griffin has suggested very recently, all forms of enclosure represent attempts to rework the spatial in relational terms. From that, it follows that breaking deer forest fences, failing to erect them properly, or taking advantage of their absence was also a form of asserting alternative and transgressive spatial forms. And we should not think that these were short-lived transgressive acts. In May 1904, an estate keeper reported observing a crofter from Strathan tearing down the marsh fence and putting crofter's sheep into Glencanisp deer forest. And that was not an isolated incident. I'm sorry, my PowerPoint seems to be again. I've got one more page to go. I shall plough on regardless. Unquestionably a means to resist the privatised and securitized sporting space. To underestimate the power of the informal land occupation does it a considerable disservice. Recent work on past protest suggests that a much closer attention to the relationship between agency and space and between the human and non-human can provide a fuller understanding of the multiple performances in play in any protest event. As this paper has hopefully demonstrated, the informal occupation of Glencanisp deer forest supports this notion. Formal land occupations in the Highlands and Islands were only the most spectacular manifestation of a process of resistance that took a multiplicity of interchangeable forms. Informal land occupations are one of these, found in a certain lack of interest from some estate owners in the normal strictures of private property. In the popular imagination, at the very least, the geography of the Highland sporting estate is one of strict management and control. At times, however, the practice was considerably different. If not with impunity, then certainly with some confidence, crofters and cotters were able to challenge, combat and resist private property in the form of the sporting ground upon which their forebears once legitimately trod, and they continued to illegitimately tread. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Iain. That was great. Thank you very much. I thought that was a really insightful and nuanced look at some of the complexities involved in post-1914 land occupation. So thank you very much for that. We have 10 minutes remaining, so hopefully we'll be able to squeeze in a few questions into that time. Just a reminder, if you want to ask a question, you'll need to unmute your microphone to do that. And to do that, just click on the same icon as you clicked on to mute it. And once it's no longer highlighted red, you should be able to launch forth with your question. So without further ado, I shall open the floor to any questions for Iain.
Everybody's terrified, obviously. Can I ask, in terms of obviously the one of the fundamental points is that idea of letting your sheep and your cattle transgress onto these lands. I suppose is there any suggestion that some of it is accidental? That the animals will wander wherever they want, and if they find a hole or something, that they'll go through it. Is some of this being seen by landowners as a deliberate act when actually it's not?
Yes, I'm sure you're right, Iain. Thanks for that. Yes, accidental, there's a hole in a fence or it's not been put up correctly. I mean, that's another thing that I hadn't really touched on there, insofar as, you know, if you're thinking about James C. Scott's everyday forms of resistance, one of the things that people do to resist is to do their job but not terribly well. So you're paid with putting up a fence. Well, you might put it up, but you're not going to put it up very well. And in Highland weather, very soon that fence is going to rust or fall down or be blown down, or just disappear into a peat bog. And yeah, you're absolutely right. And then, of course, sheep in particular, sheep and cattle, well, they don't recognize a fence. There's no fence there, so there's some nice grazing across the way. That's them wandering on. So yes, there's a lot of subtlety within this that you know, I couldn't really tease out. But yeah, thank you.
Any other questions? Feel free to just jump in whenever you have one. If you have something.
I should also apologise for the rain here. It is now absolutely hammering down, so you might be able to hear the rain on the roof.
If I may, there was you were talking a lot about Highland. Similar moves in the Lowlands that you're able to mention?
Thank you, Susan. That's a really interesting question. I'm afraid to say that I am ridiculously Highland and Islands focused, and I suspect yes. You know, you have the same sporting estate issues. You have the same privatised space issues in the Lowlands. Well, in fact, you know, what about the grouse moors of England and Wales? The same issues are there. I just haven't looked. that's the short answer there.
Thank you very much.
Hi, I just had a quick question about the specific time periods that you're focusing on, and why you chose the kind of post-World War I period, perhaps thinking about the intersections of the local and the global, and how the war might have affected those movements.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a really interesting question. Thank you. The prosaic answer is why I chose post 1914, post 1918. I was aware of existence of a really wonderfully rich archive that hadn't been mined. So it's the kind of the prosaic answer of the jobbing historian. In terms of global and local, that is a really difficult thing to tease out. It would be absolutely wrong to suggest that those connections were not made by folks on the ground. Of course they were, and there are many such examples. One that immediately springs to mind, and it perhaps doesn't answer your question, but it might do tangentially. The Vesties being very large importers. I suppose the Vesties themselves were large, but their business was very large. Importers of meat. They started the Dewhurst butchers chain. They had very large estates in northern territories in Australia, and they encountered exactly the same issues in the Northern Territories in Australia. Most of their employees were Aboriginals, and they were treated appallingly. And the first walkout movement of the 1960s and 70s amongst Aboriginal workers began on the Vesties estates in Northern Territories in Australia. So there are global connections, there are interconnections between the local and the global. I realise that's not quite where you were driving me, but that's as far as I'm going.
Thank you.
Iain, thanks very much for that. Did it blur with poaching? Because poaching clearly is also an assertion of traditional rights. Because the poacher, certainly poaching for domestic consumption for the pot, as would be said, it's not in any way regarded as a crime in a Highland context. It's seen as simply doing what you were traditionally entitled to do. And I would guess, knowing Asset, that some at least of the people who were involved in this would also have been taking the occasional deer.
Yeah, I totally agree with you. I totally agree with you, Jim. This is all on a spectrum of protest, isn't it? You know, it is very difficult and wrong, I would suggest, to say if you're a land raider, you're not a poacher. If you're driving your cattle and sheep onto deer forest to illegally graze them, you're not a land raider. You can be one and the same thing at the same and at different times, and I absolutely agree with you. That the same applies to poaching as well, perhaps even more so in many respects, because in poaching, you're right, it is traditional beliefs translated into for want of a better phrase, a modern and neoliberal liberal world in which space is enclosed and privatized, and poaching is a way of reasserting a different worldview. So yeah, I entirely agree with you. Thank you.
Question. I'm just wondering how many people were imprisoned for doing things like this. The reason I ask is because my husband's great-grandfather was one of the Razi raiders.
Ah, how interesting. Yeah, well, how many people are in prison? It's very, very difficult to put a precise figure on it, because there were so many land raids and so many arrests and so on and so forth. Instead of putting a figure on it, I think the better way of saying it is that prison was almost a rite of passage. In a way, was almost a way in which you signaled your seriousness in your desire to obtain the land. And prison, well, there is one instance in the 1920s when there was a debate. I think it was in Inverness jail, but I could be wrong there, around whether imprisoned land raiders should be designated as political prisoners or not. And the prison governor wanted to designate them as political prisoners, and the Scottish office did not, for very obvious reasons. And so it's a rite of passage. And the Razi raid is a fascinating one, isn't it? Because they were arrested, if I'm right, when they were coming back from communion in Applecross. Some fled to the hills to escape arrest, and there's a local hill on Razi now known as the Hill of the Policeman, to recognise just that, the way which people were hiding on the hills. The police force couldn't get a boat to come over from Skye to Razi to arrest them, because nobody would give them a boat. And it's almost Jim's poaching in a way, in that it's almost, and I wouldn't go that far, but it is almost that prison is not something that is a stigma, but is a rite of passage. Although if you talk to descendants of those in prison, then you would get a different picture often.
I can come in on that, Iain. I was just exactly what you said there. For the people themselves, sorry, it's Anthony here. And are we story connected with the Agonish raid when the commemorative cairn was built, and they had an event for the opening, and invitations were sent out to descendants of all those who were imprisoned in the land raids to be guests of honour. Now, my granny received one of those invitations, and she recognised the name, that it wasn't actually her grandfather, it was his brother who had been one of those imprisoned. So she duly phoned up her second cousin, the granddaughter of this gentleman, and she said words along the lines of, well, Kirschlack, I didn't know your grandfather had been in prison. To which the other Cailleach replied, neither did I till I got the invitation.
Yes, yeah,
and that proves what you were saying.
Yeah, very much so, and I've had a similar experience trying when I was doing my PhD and trying to interview descendants of those imprisoned. Usually I had a very positive response, but not always. So we have to be very alert to those sensitivities, don't we?
We're fast and rapidly over time, in fact, but we could maybe do one more short question if anybody has a burning one to fit in.
Go on, I've got time for a question for even if he's not flooded yet by the breaking banks of the Severn. Iain, thinking about the sheep in the forest before Vestes came along, are we kind of in danger of, by using the language of kind of informality, of actually kind of denying something which maybe in kind of earlier work would have been called custom, and custom with all that it comes with in terms of not only its community sanction, but also its sanction in common law?
Yes, is the short answer. The longer answer, Carl, is that protest is very nuanced, and custom in trying to understand where protest comes from is really vital. At the same time, however, I think that even though I wouldn't go back to the old tradition of allocating categories and placing events into a discrete box and then shutting the lid on that box and saying that's what that is. I think informality speaks to us of a more nuanced and a different approach to the engagement with very local spaces, particularly with deer forests. And deer forests somehow or other were different in a way. Different because they were very difficult for for the Board of Agriculture to resettle, but different in terms of their very securitized and enclosed spaces. They're being very securitized and enclosed spaces. So to think of something as informality, yes, of course, it's a looking back and an evoking of local memory and of local customary beliefs and practices, but at the same time, it's a different way of expressing antagonisms. I hope that answers your question.
Thank you very much, Iain. I'm loath to draw it to a halt, but we're 1:05 now, and as we're supposed to be lunchtime, I should probably draw it to a close. But yeah, huge thanks again for that really interesting talk. Just before we finish, the next lunchtime talk will be on the 27th of August, and it will be between 1 and 2 o'clock instead of between 12 and 1, so a slightly different time for that. And Professor David Worthington will be talking on the subject of sugar, slave owning and the Scottish Highlands before 1707. So that's the 27th of August. But thank you again, Iain, and I will release you all back to your afternoons. But thank you for all the contributions.
Thank you very much, Alison.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Still a fair few people in the meeting, Alison.